Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human-researched and written material. So imagine you have been fighting a brutal, bloody war for 10 straight years.
Right, just a decade of pure violence.
Exactly. And then you spend another 10 years just trying to get home, losing every single man in your command, surviving shipwrecks, literal starvation, and, unimaginable psychological trauma.
Oh, yeah, just the absolute worst conditions imaginable.
And you finally wash up on the shores of your homeland in the middle of the night.
Yeah.
But instead of a parade or like a hero's welcome, you wake up in a magical fog. You're completely alone.
You don't even recognize the landscape.
You don't. And you are about to discover that your house has been occupied by over 100 armed men who want to murder your son and force your wife into marriage. So today, we are immersing ourselves in the turning point of Homer's Odyssey, specifically books 13 through 18.
Yeah, and we are not here to just give you like a dusty literature lecture or summarize a myth.
No, not at all. Our goal for this deep dive is to act as your guides, helping you extract the sheer, raw, practical wisdom, the moral insight, and the life applications embedded in this text.
Because the transition in these specific books is, well, it's incredibly jarring, and it's totally intentional. Up to this point in the epic, the protagonist has been battling mythological nightmares.
Right, like the Cyclops.
The Cyclops, the Sirens, the monstrous Scylla and Charybdis, but those are external supernatural threats. The moment Ulysses touches the sand of Ithaca, the fantasy just evaporates.
The monsters become entirely devastatingly human, right?
Exactly. The threats are no longer six-headed sea beasts. They are human pride, runaway greed, toxic entitlement, and, the everyday cruelties of a society that has just completely lost its moral compass.
Which is something I think we can all relate to today, unfortunately.
Definitely. What unfolds is basically a masterclass in strategic thinking, radical restraint, and the very difficult process of recognizing genuine loyalty when the entire structure of your life has collapsed.
To really grasp the gravity of the situation, we kind of need to understand the sheer terrifying scale of the crisis waiting for him. The fog placed over Ithaca by the goddess Minerva is deeply symbolic.
Oh, heavily symbolic. He is physically home, but the truth of his home is hidden from him.
Yeah, and he has to navigate this incredibly dangerous landscape completely blind. He isn't just a husband returning to his wife. He is a king returning to a nation that has been completely destabilized.
So consider the political vacuum created by a 20-year absence. In the Bronze Age Mediterranean, authority was not like an abstract concept maintained by institutions or a standing police force.
Right, there's no constitution or courts protecting his seat.
Exactly. A king's authority was inextricably tied to his physical presence, his bodily strength, and his immediate capacity for violence to enforce the law. So with Ulysses gone for 2 decades, the social order hasn't just weakened, it is essentially disintegrated.
Wow. And the text tells us there are 108 suitors from the surrounding islands, right? Places like Dulichium, Samo, Zacynthus, and Ithaca itself.
And these are not random thugs off the street.
Right. These are the young aristocratic elite. They command their own retinues, servants, and ships. They are, for all practical purposes, an occupying army that has just moved into Ulysses' palace.
Squatting there under the thin pretext of courting his wife, Penelope.
And they are systematically destroying his estate. They are exploiting something that was, incredibly sacred to the ancient Greeks, the law of genia or hospitality.
Yeah, they are literally eating his estate into ruin.
The text goes out of its way to describe them slaughtering his finest cattle, his sheep, and his pigs every single day, drinking through his stores of vintage wines, led by these incredibly arrogant, manipulative men like Antinous and Eumaeus.
Which naturally makes you wonder, why doesn't Penelope or the local townspeople just kick them out?
Right, like just call the guards and throw them out the door?
Well, the mechanics of Xenia are crucial here because they explain why this situation is so paralyzed. In the ancient Mediterranean world, there were no hotels, no secure trade routes, and no international law.
So if you traveled and washed up on a foreign shore, you were basically entirely at the mercy of the locals.
Exactly. You would either be treated as a jest, or you would be killed or enslaved. There was really no middle ground.
That's terrifying.
It was. So because civilization itself depended on safe travel and trade, hospitality was considered a sacred contract protected by Jove, the king of the gods. The host provides food, shelter, and protection unconditionally.
And the guest, in return, provides respect, shares news, and most importantly, eventually leaves without overstaying their welcome.
Right, they have to leave. But the suitors have taken the sacred foundation of civilization and basically weaponized it. They are guests who simply refuse to leave.
Knowing full well that if Penelope or Ulysses' remaining family resort to violence to evict them, they would be breaking the sacred law of hospitality themselves.
Which could spark a regional war with the families of those 108 noblemen.
It's just brilliant, toxic manipulation. It's like a hostile corporate takeover where the attackers are using the company's own bylaws to drain its accounts.
That is a perfect analogy, actually.
Think about it. Imagine you're the CEO of a massive, successful enterprise. You get lost at sea, presumed dead. In your absence, a coalition of aggressive rival board members steps in.
They don't officially fire you, but they just start looting the company pension fund.
Exactly. Expensing lavish million-dollar parties every single night on the corporate card and aggressively trying to force your spouse to sign over the controlling shares. Meanwhile, your son, in this case, Telemachus, is treated like a junior employee with zero voting power.
Just forced to sit in the corner and watch these predators destroy his inheritance.
Yeah, the corporate raider analogy really captures the parasitic nature of the suitors perfectly. Telemachus is dealing with this catastrophic psychological burden. He's a young man who has grown up entirely in the shadow of a legendary father he has never even met.
His childhood home has been an ongoing hostage situation for his entire adolescence. And in these books, Telemachus is actually returning from his own dangerous journey to places like Pylos and Sparta.
Desperately searching for intelligence about his father.
Right. And the suitors are acutely aware that Telemachus is reaching the age of maturity. They are so terrified of him coming into his own power and legally challenging them that they've literally stationed a ship in the strait between Ithaca and Samos.
To ambush and assassinate him before he can even reach his own docks, the tension there is just incredible. Telemachus is literally sailing into a death trap.
He really is. But there's this striking moment right before he leaves Sparta. He receives an omen.
Oh, the eagle, right.
Yeah, an eagle flies overhead carrying a massive white goose it snatched right out of a farmyard. And Helen of Troy is standing right there, and she interprets the omen instantly.
She says the eagle is Ulysses, who has suffered and wandered, returning to strike down the fat, lazy, domesticated geese, meaning the suitors who have been looting his house.
And that detail about looting is key. Homer spends a vast amount of the text detailing exactly how many pigs, sheep, and cows the suitors are consuming because he is conveying a vital economic and moral truth.
To the ancient audience, livestock was wealth.
Right.
It was their currency.
It was the currency, the bank account, and the future security of the household. So the suitors aren't just being rude house guests. They're committing a cosmic crime. They're dismantling the oikos, the fundamental building block of Greek society.
Because the household was the center of religious, economic, and social order.
Exactly. By bleeding Ulysses' oikos dry, they are threatening the very fabric of civilized society. This demands more than a polite eviction. It demands a total systemic cleansing.
So Ulysses faces this monumental mathematical problem. He is one man. He has to defeat 108 well-fed, heavily armed young noblemen in the prime of their lives, plus their assorted henchmen. How does he do it?
Well, when the goddess Minerva intervenes, she doesn't hand him a magical weapon of mass destruction.
She doesn't summon an army of immortal soldiers to storm the beaches either.
No, she gives him the most counterintuitive advantage possible. A disguise.
Yeah, she withers his skin, strips the yellow hair from his head, blears his bright eyes, and dresses him in filthy, smoke-stained, tattered rags. She literally transforms the great conqueror of Troy into a miserable, invisible, old, homeless beggar. But this disguise sets up a gauntlet of psychological torture. We aren't talking about physical endurance like tying himself to the mast to resist the sirens. This is about ego mastery. The indignities he has to suffer are just staggering.
Oh, they really are. Let's look at the first real test. Ulysses is walking into town with his loyal swineherd. On the road, they encounter Melanthius, the goatherd.
And this man is Ulysses' own employee, a servant whose livelihood comes from the king's estate, but he has eagerly aligned himself with the suitors.
Yeah, and Melanthius unleashes this torrent of verbal abuse on Ulysses, calling him a filthy glutton, a plate licker. And then, completely unprovoked, Melanthius physically kicks Ulysses hard in the hip as he walks past.
The internal mechanics of that moment are profound. The text reveals Ulysses' immediate physiological and psychological reaction.
Yeah.
He internally debates whether to fly at Melanthius and beat his brains out with his wooden staff.
Or to lift him up and smash his skull into the ground. I mean, remember the man we are dealing with. This is the warrior who designed the Trojan horse.
A man whose instinct, honed by decades of brutal combat, is immediate, lethal violence.
Right. To be struck by a treacherous servant is an unfathomable insult. But instead of killing him, Ulysses stands firm as a rock. He actively swallows the rage.
He chooses to absorb the humiliation, letting the goatherd walk away just to protect the larger strategic mission.
Think about what is happening to his body in that exact second. His heart rate is skyrocketing. His adrenaline is flooding his system. His muscles are coiled to strike.
And he just, shuts it down. He stops. And it doesn't end there. He finally gets inside his own banquet hall. He is forced to beg for literal crumbs of his own food from the very men who are stealing it.
And Antinous, who is the ringleader and the most arrogant of the suitors, openly mocks him.
Ulysses pushes back verbally, pointing out the incredible hypocrisy that Antinous is gorging himself on another man's food, but refuses to spare even a pinch of salt for a starving beggar.
And Antinous completely loses his temper. He grabs a heavy, solid wood footstool and hurls it across the room, striking Ulysses squarely in the back, right on the shoulder blade.
The physical impact of a wooden footstool thrown by a young, athletic nobleman would be severe. Yet Homer repeats that exact phrase again. Ulysses stood, firm as a rock.
He doesn't stagger, he doesn't cry out, he just shakes his head in silence, his mind intensely focused on the retribution to come.
The physical pain of the blow is trivial compared to the immense psychological discipline required to not immediately reach for a weapon. He is watching men actively court his wife and consume his legacy, and he forces himself to play the pathetic victim.
Then there's the fight with Iris, which is just wild. Iris is the local town tramp, this hulking guy who runs errands for the suitors.
Iris sees Ulysses as competition for the daily scraps and tries to aggressively run him off the property. The suitors think this is hilarious and force them into a literal fistfight for their entertainment.
Offering a blood pudding as the prize of all things.
Right. So Ulysses pulls up his rags to fight, revealing these massive, heavily scarred, muscular thighs and shoulders. Iris is suddenly terrified, but the fight happens anyway.
And as they engage, Ulysses is doing complex calculus in his head. He realizes that if he hits this man with his full power, he will shatter his skull and kill him instantly.
And if the town tramp dies from a single punch, the suitors will immediately realize this is no ordinary beggar, and his cover is blown.
So in the heat of a physical brawl, Ulysses intentionally dials back his strength, choosing a precise strike to merely shatter Iris's jaw and knock him unconscious.
The evolution of the hero here is the entire point of these books. The young Ulysses at the walls of Troy was characterized by bold, loud, and sometimes deeply impulsive action.
But this weathered, older Ulysses demonstrates a much more sophisticated understanding of power.
Yes. The ultimate test of power is not your ability to inflict violence upon the world. It is your capacity to withhold it. His greatest weapon is no longer the spear.
It's his superhuman self-control. He's become the absolute master of his own ego.
Let's bring this right into the modern day. We aren't infiltrating palaces in disguise, but we face threats to our ego every single day.
Absolutely. Think about your own life right now. How do you react when your ego is threatened?
Like when someone sends you a deeply passive-aggressive, condescending email and copies your boss on it.
Oh, that's the worst. Or when a colleague subtly takes credit for your months of hard work during a department meeting. Or even just when someone cuts you off in traffic and flips you off.
Our instinct in those moments is intensely primal. We want to retaliate immediately. We want to pick up the footstool and throw it back. We want to draft that blistering, emotionally charged reply-all email and hit send.
And modern neuroscience maps perfectly onto this ancient Bronze Age text. When you are insulted or undermined, the threat triggers your amygdala.
That's the ancient primitive fear and anger center of your brain, right?
Exactly. The amygdala effectively hijacks your nervous system. It floods your body with cortisol and adrenaline, completely bypassing the prefrontal cortex, which is the evolved, logical, strategic part of your brain responsible for long-term planning.
Right. So your amygdala is basically screaming at you to beat the goatherd's brains out.
The biological urge is to reestablish dominance immediately. Ulysses represents the triumph of the prefrontal cortex over the primal ego.
He recognizes that reacting in anger might feel incredibly satisfying for about 3 seconds, but it will result in his immediate death and the permanent loss of his kingdom.
He successfully separates his core identity from the insult. When Antinous throws the stool, Ulysses doesn't internalize it. He doesn't think, I am a weak beggar who deserves to be abused.
His internal monologue is, I am the rightful king at Ithaca, I am gathering intelligence, and this violent fool is currently digging his own grave.
Which is such a powerful mindset shift.
It really is. And this brings us to a highly practical tool you can use this week. We are calling it the Ulysses pause. The practice is simple, but execution is incredibly difficult.
When you are insulted, undermined, or your ego flares up, you must create a mandatory buffer before you respond.
If it's a toxic email, you draft the response, leave it in your drafts folder, and force yourself to wait 24 hours before looking at it again.
Or if you are in a tense meeting and someone takes a shot at you, you force yourself to take a deep breath, take a slow sip of water, and count to 5.
You observe the insult landing, just like Ulysses observing the footstool hitting his back, without immediately reacting to it.
And during that designated pause, you engage your prefrontal cortex with a very specific reflection. You ask yourself, am I reacting right now merely to protect my fragile ego in the short term, or am I acting strategically to secure my ultimate long-term goal?
Because if hitting reply all and destroying your coworker with a sarcastic comeback only serves your pride, but ultimately damages your professional reputation or derails the project, you have to absorb the blow.
You have to stand firm as a rock. The Ulysses pause is fundamentally about reclaiming your agency from your own biological emotional reflexes.
Now, I want to pivot slightly because Ulysses can't take back his house through self-control alone. He eventually needs allies. But how do you find a loyal ally when you are forbidden from revealing who you are?
He has to figure out who has remained loyal in a totally corrupt environment. And this brings us to Eumaeus, the swineherd.
Yes, Eumaeus. When Ulysses first lands on Ithaca, Minerva doesn't send him to the palace. She sends him out into the rural backcountry to find the guy who feeds the pigs.
And Eumaeus is arguably the moral center of the entire epic. Homer's affection for this character is so deep that he repeatedly breaks the narrative fourth wall to address him directly in the text.
Writing things like, and you answered him, O swineherd Eumaeus, which is a profound literary honor.
It is, and Eumaeus' backstory is tragic and completely out of his control. He was not born into slavery. He was actually the son of a king on an island called Syra.
But when he was a young boy, his nurse, a Phoenician woman who had been seduced by visiting Phoenician pirates, kidnapped him.
Yeah, she smuggled him onto the pirate ship to pay for her passage back to her homeland.
The story is brutal. The nurse gets struck by the goddess Diana while at sea and falls into the ship's hold dead, like a seabird dropping from the sky. The pirates keep sailing and eventually sell the kidnapped little prince to Ulysses' father, Laertes, in Ithaca.
So Eumaeus experiences a catastrophic fall from grace. He goes from being royalty to occupying the absolute lowest rung of the social hierarchy. He is property, tasked with tending animals.
Yet, despite this unimaginable loss of status and freedom, his character remains completely uncorrupted. For 20 years, while the so-called noblemen are acting like ravenous beasts in the palace, this enslaved swineherd has been the one quietly maintaining the foundation of the estate.
The text really emphasizes his physical labor. He has built massive, complex pig enclosures by hand, gathering heavy field stones to protect the herds from wild animals and thieves.
He even bought an assistant with his own meager resources to help manage the property.
And when a miserable, ragged, unknown beggar Ulysses in disguise shows up at his isolated hut, Eumaeus demonstrates the purest form of Xenia.
He slaughters a prime pig to feed the stranger, he constructs a makeshift bed for him, and he insists the beggar take his own thick winter cloak to survive the freezing night.
While Eumaeus goes out into the rain to guard the herd himself. All the while, he speaks of his lost master Ulysses with unwavering reverence and grief.
The theme of unseen loyalty continues with what might be the most emotional scene in the entire story. The scene with Argos, the dog.
Oh man, the dog. That part is just heartbreaking.
Ulysses and Eumaeus are finally walking up to the gates of the palace, and lying there, completely abandoned on a massive pile of mule and cow dung, is Argos.
This was a magnificent hunting dog that Ulysses had personally bred and trained right before he left for the Trojan War.
Now, 20 years later, the dog is ancient, half-blind, crippled, and infested with fleas. The servants have completely neglected him.
It is a devastating portrait of decay. But as Ulysses approaches the gates, disguised so thoroughly in magic and rags that his own wife and closest friends will not recognize him, Argos instantly knows.
The dog perceives the true masker beneath the filth. Argos drops his ears, and he manages to wag his tail, but he is far too physically weak to even drag himself over to Ulysses.
And Ulysses sees this creature that he loved reduced to garbage, and he has to secretly turn his head and dash a tear from his eye so Eumaeus won't see him break character.
And then, having finally witnessed the return of his master after 2 decades of waiting, Argos closes his eyes and dies right there on the dung heap.
It's just an incredibly powerful moment.
But I have to challenge the narrative structure here for a second. We are reading a grand, heroic epic. We've spent time with gods, magical nymphs, cyclops, and kings. Why does Homer hit the brakes on the action to spend entire chapters focusing on a pig farmer and a dying, flea-ridden dog?
From a pacing perspective, it does seem like a bizarre choice to elevate the absolute bottom of the social barrel.
Right, so why do it?
Because it is a deliberate, brilliant subversion of expectations. Homer is forcefully arguing that true virtue has absolutely nothing to do with social class, wealth, or titles.
Think of the swineherd and the dog as the unseen infrastructure of society.
Exactly. The aristocratic suitors possess all the markers of greatness. They are wealthy, beautiful, well-spoken, and high-born, but they are a moral rot, eating the kingdom from the inside out.
Conversely, the enslaved swineherd and the discarded animal display the absolute highest virtues of the Greek world: steadfast loyalty, equity, honor, and duty.
Homer's insisting that true character is defined entirely by how you behave when you have no power, when no one is watching, and when there is absolutely zero reward for doing the right thing.
I love the idea of unseen infrastructure. Eumaeus is like the vital IT department of a modern digital company.
Right. The executives might be in the glass boardroom drinking sparkling water, completely oblivious, but if the servers go down, the whole company dies.
The people doing the invisible labor are the ones actually keeping the lights on. Let's translate this into a modern practice. We are calling it the Argos check. Look critically at your own life. Look at your organization, your neighborhood, your church, your family.
Who are the people quietly doing the heavy lifting when no one is watching? We have a cultural sickness where we obsess over the suitors.
The flashy executives, the loud social media influencers, the people who constantly demand attention and take up all the oxygen in the room.
Meanwhile, we completely ignore the swineherds who actually maintain the systems we rely on.
Genuine leadership is about piercing through the fog of status and identifying who actually holds the line when a crisis hits. When a corporation undergoes a massive reorganization or a family is struck by a sudden illness, it is almost never the loudest person who carries the burden.
It is the quiet administrator who organizes the schedules, the janitor who stays late, the dependable sibling who handles the medical paperwork without being asked.
They're the ones gathering the fieldstones and building the walls while everyone else is feasting. So your practice for this week is to implement the Argos check.
Make it a conscious, daily habit to acknowledge the invisible labor that supports your life. Learn the name of the person who sets up the complex Zoom meetings.
Thank the custodian who empties the trash in your office building. Acknowledge the quiet team member who always catches the critical typos before the client presentation goes out, but never asks for the spotlight.
And just ask yourself this deeply uncomfortable question. How do I treat people who have absolutely no power to help or hurt my career?
Because if you treat the CEO with deference and respect, but you ignore the barista or speak down to the customer service rep, you are actively aligning yourself with the suitors.
You are failing the test of character that Ulysses is administering.
Now, I want to pivot to a really thorny area, because we can't just sit here and pretend that everything in this Bronze Age text is a perfect, sanitized moral guide for today.
There are definitely elements of this story that are going to deeply offend a modern listener, and we need to confront them head on. Let's talk about the pathological lying.
The deception is pervasive, and it requires careful unpacking. Ulysses lies to literally everyone. I'm not just talking about keeping his identity a secret. He spins these massive, incredibly intricate webs of falsehoods.
When he meets Eumaeus, the swineherd who is showing him such pure kindness, Ulysses doesn't just say, "I'm a beggar from the mainland, please help me."
No, he invents a cinematic, multi-chapter backstory. He claims to be a Cretan pirate, the illegitimate son of a wealthy Anne who went to Egypt, got captured, went to Cyprus, was betrayed by a Phoenician. It goes on for pages.
He lies to his own son. He lies to his wife. And speaking of Penelope, she comes down into the great hall looking radiant and actively manipulates the suitors.
She tricks them into giving her lavish gifts, extorting gold chains, amber beads, and embroidered robes out of them by making them believe she is finally ready to choose one of them to marry.
And Ulysses, sitting in the corner in his filthy rags, is secretly thrilled and applauding her for scamming them.
So why are we idolizing a protagonist who's essentially a highly skilled con artist?
To understand the lying, we really have to understand the environment. We have to separate modern moral frameworks from the brutal realities of the ancient Mediterranean.
The Greek concept at play here is metis, which translates to cunning, craftiness, or highly adaptable intelligence.
In a world with no safety nets where violence is random and the sea can swallow you whole at any moment, metis was considered the ultimate survival skill. It was prized far above pure physical force, which they called bia.
But isn't there a line between surviving and just being a toxic manipulator?
The line is drawn by the ultimate objective. We live in a society that highly values transparency, authenticity, and straightforwardness, and rightly so, because we rely on institutional trust.
But Ulysses is operating behind enemy lines in an active war zone. The lies he tells Eumaeus are not malicious. They are protective camouflage.
He spins the elaborate tale of the Cretan pirate to test Eumaeus' reactions, to gauge his loyalty to Ulysses, and to ensure he isn't walking into a trap.
So the enduring wisdom we extract from this isn't you should compulsively lie to your coworkers. The profound lesson is about the absolute necessity of adaptability.
Adaptability as a survival mechanism. Exactly. Ulysses survives 20 years of hell because he refuses to be rigid. He is intellectually and psychologically fluid.
When the situation requires a ruthless warrior, he becomes the warrior. When survival dictates he must be a humble, groveling beggar, he seamlessly adopts that persona.
When he needs to be a charming storyteller, he weaves a masterpiece. The danger in modern life is becoming so rigidly attached to one identity, one method of working, or one way of viewing the world, that when the environment drastically changes, you shatter.
Like when you lose your job, when an industry shifts, or when a relationship ends. Ulysses survives because he reads the room, assesses the threats, and adapts his approach without losing sight of his core mission.
Getting his home back.
Okay, I could accept the adaptability argument, but what about the gods? The theology in this text is horrifying.
It really is wild.
When Neptune, or Poseidon, the god of the sea, finds out that the Phaeacians, who were famous for their hospitality, gave Ulysses a safe ride home to Ithaca, he throws a massive petty temper tantrum.
He complains to Jove, and Jove, the supposed king of justice, casually suggests that Neptune should wait until the Phaeacian ship is pulling back into their home harbor and turn the ship and its crew into solid stone right in front of the entire city.
And then bury the city under a mountain just to terrify them. And Neptune does it. The Phaeacians are brutally punished for doing a genuinely good deed. It is deeply unsettling and feels completely unjust.
It is unjust by our standards, and this is where we must exercise wisdom with discernment. We cannot and should not adopt the ancient Greek view of the divine.
Their gods were not the omnibenevolent, morally perfect beings envisioned by later monotheistic religion.
No, the Greek gods were essentially immortal humans with infinite power and zero impulse control. They were transactional, deeply jealous, and often cruel.
So what do we do with that? Just ignore it?
No, we read it as a reflection of how the ancients experienced the world. The punishment of the Phaeacians reflects a terrifying historical worldview. The universe was fundamentally chaotic, capricious, and largely indifferent to human suffering.
Doing a good deed did not guarantee you safety.
Not at all. You could be a good person, honor the laws of hospitality, and a tsunami or an invading army could still wipe your city off the map tomorrow.
We can acknowledge the psychological reality of living in such a brutal, unpredictable world without adopting the theology that justifies it. It teaches us about ancient anxiety, not eternal morality.
That makes perfect sense. It's a mirror of their harsh reality, not a blueprint for our ethics. And this brings us perfectly to our final thematic area, comparative insight and the danger of hubris.
There is an incredibly poignant, tragic moment in Book 18. Ulysses has just finished the fistfight with the tramp Iris. One of the suitors, a man named Amphinomus, is impressed.
He brings the disguised Ulysses 2 loaves of bread and a cup of wine in a golden goblet.
The text goes out of its way to describe Amphinomus as a man of good understanding, relatively speaking. He is arguably the least terrible person in a very bad crowd.
And Ulysses, recognizing a sliver of decency in him, actually breaks his strict code of silence to try and save the man's life.
It is a profound, tense interaction. Ulysses gives Amphinomus a severe philosophical warning. He looks at this young, wealthy nobleman and tells him that man is the frailest, most vain of all creatures on earth.
When the gods grant us health, wealth, and success, We convince ourselves that no harm will ever touch us. We take our prosperity as a permanent guarantee.
Ulysses essentially says, I used to be proud, violent, and rich, relying on my father and brothers. Look at me now. The true king is very near. He is returning. You need to leave this house and go back to your own lands before blood is spilled.
It's a direct, undeniable warning, and the text says Amphinomus feels a deep, chilling sense of doom.
He walks away, shaking his head, his heart filled with dread. He knows in his gut that the beggar is right, but he stays.
He sits right back down at the banquet table.
Why doesn't he leave? If you get a premonition of your own death, why do you ignore it?
Amphinomus is the classic victim of the ancient Greek sequence of hubris and asininity. Hubris is blinding, arrogant pride, or a fatal omic estimation of one's own safety, which leads inevitably to ephite, meaning ruin or destruction.
Amphinomus is paralyzed by the comfort of the crowd and the powerful inertia of his social status. Think about how true this is today.
People constantly receive warnings in life, a slightly alarming medical test result they decide to ignore, a serious warning from a spouse about their behavior, or a deep feeling of unease about the ethics of a business deal.
But because everyone else in the office is doing it, or because it would be socially awkward to leave the party, they stay.
Precisely. The social pressure of the group and the comfortable warmth of the status quo causes them to override their own intuition.
Amphinomus is doomed not just by the decree of the gods, but by his own psychological inability to break away from the toxic culture of his peers. He chooses the comfort of the herd over the difficult, lonely action required to save himself.
That is a universally human flaw. And it highlights how the whole structure of these books, the disguised king arriving as a beggar to test the arrogant elite, is an archetype that echoes across almost every culture and era in human history.
The resonance is global. You see exactly this narrative structure in Hindu mythology, where powerful deities walk the earth disguised as impoverished, diseased mortals, specifically to test the dharma, the righteousness of kings and wealthy merchants.
You see it heavily in the biblical tradition, too. There is the famous concept from the book of Hebrews about entertaining angels unaware, the idea that the desperate stranger at your door might actually be a divine test of your character.
You even see a highly secularized, modern version of it in reality TV shows like Undercover Boss, where the CEO puts on a fake mustache and a uniform to see how the frontline workers are really being treated by middle management.
It speaks to a fundamental driving human longing. We have this deep collective desire for the powerful, the wealthy, and the arrogant to be judged on their true moral character, stripped of their protective titles, their bank accounts, and their armor.
We want to know what people are genuinely made of when the trappings of power are entirely removed. In these books, Ulysses becomes the ultimate auditor of his own kingdom.
He is systematically testing the true alignment of everyone's moral compass. When the absolute ruler of the land appears as a starving tramp, how do you treat him? That, Homer's telling us, is the ultimate test of a civilization.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with one final provocative thought to mull over as you go about your week. We established at the very beginning that Ulysses' feet touched the physical soil of Ithaca in Book 13.
He has physically crossed the border, but he isn't truly home.
No, he is a ghost in his own kingdom. He is an alien in the place he belongs. And I think there is a profound, challenging truth there for us today. Being physically present in a place or even arriving at a long-sought phase of your life does not mean you have actually reclaimed it.
Maybe you've moved back to your hometown after a decade away, or you have finally returned to a job after a leave of absence, or you are desperately trying to rebuild a fractured relationship after a major conflict.
Physical proximity is never enough. Sometimes, to truly reclaim your identity, to rebuild your household, or to find your peace of mind, you have to first allow yourself to become a stranger to it.
You have to step back, observe the situation objectively without letting your ego react, endure the discomfort of not being instantly recognized or validated, and then do the hard, quiet, strategic work of winning your life back piece by piece.
That's the heart of this section. This is wisdom for the present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.